So this is a little bit a change of tack because this is not a hands-on. So this is more talking. Sorry about that. But I think it's quite unique in that, as far as I know, there's not too much talking like this happening in the community yet. Most of the talking is about like what are APIs and why do you need APIs and how does it work? And but very little is being talked about how do you document APIs and how do you people are talking about developer experience, but it feels like it's still very narrow, the knowledge about it. So what we've set out, first maybe a quick introduction. So I'm Christophe van Tomme. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pronovix, which is a 30 people strong Drupal agency. So we're specialized in Drupal, which is a content management system that, as it happens, Apigee uses for their developer portal. Then when a year ago I started looking around, trying to find out, who would be a good API management company to partner with to do developer portals, because we're really excited about documentation. And APIs is kind of booming, and yeah, documentation, right? It's I first got that 5 years ago. I got that reaction from my developers, and now they're kind of used to it. So we were really excited about documentation, and then it turned out that Apigee was already using Drupal, which was like epic win, because we could come in and help them with their developer portals and with customization for their existing customers. And now, well, it's been crazy. The last since the summer, I don't know how many we've done, but we've done a lot of developer portals, like 10 or more portals that we've been customizing for Apigee. So I'm a bit of a weird duck because I'm not a developer. I'm a bioengineer. It's a long story, really long story. But I started my career configuring Drupal sites. So I'm a click monkey, I used to call myself. I configure sites. I think about site architecture, and I'm really kind of a content reuse geek. And that's how I got into the DITA community, which is a documentation community. It's XML, very scary for a lot of people, but it's kind of cool. And the Drupal community, obviously, because of Drupal, we're 10 years in that community. And then the DevRel community, that's the developer evangelists. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. And then the Write the Docs community, which is a technical writer community. So we're an Apigee partner and an Acquia partner. Acquia is a Drupal hosting company. So we're specialized, for this presentation, I was kind of thinking, how do I say what we do? And I think this is what we do. It's developer portals that are more than the default. And I think for most organizations, or for a lot of organizations, this is actually needed. What I'm going to be talking about, this is like the 7 kind of main areas that I'll be talking about. But there's also there's 7, right? Yeah, there's 7. There's 7 lessons that I'll be pulling from all of this. They're slightly different, but they're related to these topics. But first, why are developer portals important? I think this is pretty obvious, right? Adoption. Or first, everybody knows what is a developer portal, because I just jump in here. You're familiar with that? Anybody doesn't know?
I don't know.
Okay, a quick introduction. Don't worry, no, please do tell, and don't feel, if there's anything you don't understand or that you're not familiar with. I'm used to using a lot of language that's sometimes very geeky and specific, domain specific. So a developer portal is a website where developers can go to learn how to use your API. That's very shortly what it is about. It should have documentation. It should have onboarding tutorials, ways to get your, if you don't want to be spending a lot of time explaining over and over and over again how to use your API, you need a developer portal. That's what it is. So then a developer portal is very important for adoption because it will make it easier for people to use your API. So that's going to help drive adoption. It's important for driving down support cost, as I said. If you don't want to be spending a lot of time explaining over and over again how to use your API, you need this. The thing that most people don't really realize is this one, is that it's also a trust signal. So just like banks, money and banks, they're not real, right? They're only there because we believe that they're there. The moment that people lose their trust in banks, it's over. It's game over. That's why they have buildings like this. APIs are like that. APIs are very similar. APIs need trust signals that tell developers, we're going to be around for a while. It's okay to integrate with us. We're not going to disappear. And a developer portal, because it's like a public-facing thing for your API, it can be a really good tool for that, because you can do updates in the content there, you can do updates in the design, things that, just like the banks, like these really big buildings that show we're invested in this. The same way a developer portal can help you give that signal to your community. And that's important, because else they'll go somewhere else. Because there's a lot of horror stories about APIs that either just suddenly change or that are closed down, like LinkedIn's API. I don't know if you know that story, but LinkedIn had several CRMs integrating with their API. And then from one day to the next, they were like, oh, change of policy. From now on, only Microsoft and Salesforce can use our API. So sorry, you guys, you've built your whole business on us, but we're going to close down. Stuff like that should not happen. And developers are very cautious about it. So that's why you need trust signals. For who are developer portals? Now, this is kind of like a duh, right? But actually it's not, because I think there's actually 7 personas, 7 types of users for a developer portal. And that sounds like a lot. But once you start thinking about what is a developer portal really, and so what is an API really? And I'm sure you've heard this before. APIs should be products, not projects. So when they're products, it means that you have a product owner. If you have a product, it means that you have salespeople involved. If you have a product, it means you have marketing people. So all of these 3, sales, product, marketing, are stakeholders in your developer portal, because they need a tool through which they will be able to communicate with their audience, your customers. Here comes another of those terms, developer evangelist or developer advocate. Those are 2 terms that are being used in the community. They're a breed of people. They're kind of weird because they have a marketing hat and a sales hat and a product hat. And they're actually developers. They're kind of like unicorns. If you look around in the community, really successful companies that are doing successful API programs typically will be employing developer evangelists to go out and spread the gospel about the API in a developer-friendly way. Because you can't just go to developers and say, my product is the best and my API is fantastic. They won't believe it. You need developers that will show just do this one thing and look, wow, bam. This is, our APIs are awesome, but we don't say it, we just show it. And that's a different way of doing things. So that's 4. And then I think you probably will also need some form of support and documentarians, people that will write documentation about your API. What I've heard a lot, and I think this is actually a maturity model for an API program or product. If you have, a lot of API products start out with just developers. And then they realize, we're not getting traction, this is not working, what's wrong? And then they'll probably hear about developer evangelists, maybe hire a developer evangelist. They'll get started, they'll be all over the place, going to events, trying to write the documentation, get completely burned out. This is typical in the industry, if you know developer evangelists. And then they'll start thinking about bringing in additional people that can help with some of the roles of a developer evangelist. One of those is documentation writing, and probably you should be thinking about that. Because from what I've seen, most of the time when things start failing because the developers can't write it well enough, people will bring in documentation people. Then that brings us to 7 again, personas. So the internal developer, the people that write the API, the external developers that will consume the API, the product owners, the salespeople, marketing, developer evangelists, and documentarians. Those are all people that will be interacting with your developer portal, and writing and having a good portal will make their jobs easier. And probably you need to be thinking about all of these. So the next framework that I'd like to introduce is the developer's journey. And I'd like to think that a developer's journey could be a viral loop. I don't know if you've heard of that term, a viral loop. My Dutch is, I'm struggling with that. I don't know why, it's just always in English. So a viral loop is something from the startup community where people are talking about, growing giant businesses on a shoestring. And one of the key things there is trying to create viral loops. And what it means is that you have a product, you get people to use it, and then you somehow turn them into your advocates that will talk about it and get you more adoption, and then the whole thing starts all over again. And if your viral coefficient is higher than 1, then you have free growth, right? Because people just talk about your products and spread the news. I think APIs can be like this because developers are typically small communities, and they'll be talking with each other. There's a lot of meetups that they'll go to. So if you have a really good, easy to use API, and maybe you have some developer evangelists, you should be able to get a viral loop going. So how do you do that? First of all, you shouldn't be doing this. Most people do this when they create a developer portal. They take their Swagger documentation and just publish that. The thing is that we call this reference documentation. Reference documentation is something that experienced users can use. So when you do this, you're basically creating a developer portal for your developers and for people that already know how to use your API. And that's kind of a bad idea because they're already using your API, so they're not your main audience. Like your main audience are the people that still need to discover it and have to get started. So, and if you think about discovery, then you actually need something on your portal that will help people to find it. So ideally, depending on what your API is about, right? If it's a partner API and you only want your existing partners to use it, probably this is less important. But if your API is like kind of like a Trojan horse for your business, and it's the tool that you're going to use to get people to start using you as a product, then you need something that is like interesting and really well optimized for SEO, so that people can find your documentation portal and learn about your product. You also need to enable people to evaluate your API. So you probably want like a mock API or something like that. And Apigee has a product for that. And then you need tutorials. And this is kind of like we're still trying to figure out like what different types of tutorials are out there, because we're doing research at the moment about different components that you can have on developer portals, and there's like there's 4 or 5 different types of labels that people use to address this kind of how to get started thing, and they're all slightly different, and we're trying to kind of unravel the maze. But we have a blog post about that, like about different types of it. But you would definitely need something that will, like kind of like what you're doing today, right? Like just getting started, and with screenshots to make it easy, so that people can start playing with your product and say like, oh, this actually is kind of cool, and look at all this stuff that I'm doing now, like putting all these policies and whatever. That sounds really complicated, and I just drag my icon and it's working. And I think that's the kind of thing that you also want with your API, to get developers excited and to make them feel powerful. Like, I'm doing these cool things and I didn't do anything really. I just integrated with it. And then the troubleshooting. But as I said, the conceptual document, reference documentation is like for people that are already advanced. You might also want to, and this is something that we're looking at, there's a professor in Germany that has some really interesting findings about using or not using conceptual documentation inside of reference documentation. What I mean with that is, for example, in payment gateways, there's something called dunning. It's like a very technical term. I didn't know what it was until I started playing with a payments gateway. It's a process through which you can get rid of people that are not paying you. Like, credit card is declined. You want to tell them that their credit card is declined so that you don't lose a customer. But if they don't pay, you want to get rid of them, right? So that's dunning. But like, if somebody comes in and starts using your API and they don't know that word, they're kind of like, yeah, and they have to start looking for it. So Michael Meng, that's also research that we refer to. He's been checking like what does that mean for the onboarding speed of developers. It's kind of interesting. And the last part, celebrate. And what I mean with that is when people have created a really cool integration, you want to give them a spot on your portal to show off. And the interesting thing is that could be kind of like your viral growth thing, because they can be pointing at it like, we're featured on something's API portal with our integration, and like, look how cool that is. And that can drive more developers to your portal because their friends will see that and maybe go and check it out and then start looking like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I can also use this one. So that's what I mean with the viral loop. Okay. Next, I want to talk about jobs to be done. So I talked earlier about personas, like different types of users. There's another stream in user experience research, which uses the jobs to be done framework. And the idea there is that personas often it's probably too deep, but personas is this idea of making kind of a virtual person that then is using your portal, and you try to think like, what would Frank do? That kind of stuff. Jobs to be done is like, forget about Frank. What does Frank need to do? Frank needs to be able to get started on this portal. So I think that there's three main jobs that you need to help people get done on your portal. And this is a diagram that we created working with one customer, where they had this idea about like, we need a portal and we need all these things to happen. And then our UX researcher put this together, and it was like, oh wow, because it kind of brought all of that in kind of a flow, and it made it easier to understand. And probably it's not the same for every developer portal, but it's interesting to think about that. And I think there's three main jobs to do. One is inspire, is like get people excited about your API, which is often forgotten. Like most portals are super dry. Educate is kind of okay, although that you want to address different audiences so that you can take people from where they are to where you want them to be, and not just from you're already using our portal. And then authorize. And this is like, a lot of APIs fail here because they got this crazy process where you need to sign an NDA and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it takes months until you get access to the API. You need to reduce that. Like they have the 5 minutes until first hello world. You want to reduce the length of that process. Another interesting thing that we started seeing kind of bubbling up from working with our clients was that there's different types of architecture. And this is kind of interesting because now important is that these are all kind of intermingled. So sometimes you'll have like different types together in one, but there's the archetypes that mix depending on your specific situation. This is what everybody thinks about, and this is what most of the products are built for. It's like a public API. What I mean with public is, as soon as you can see the site, it might be behind a firewall, it's like flat. And everybody has access to all the API documentation. There's no segmentation, it's just all there. And sometimes you need to still get like behind a firewall or log in or something to be able to see it, but there's no segmentation. And this is kind of simple. These are the simplest developer portals. Most of them are like this is the kind of things that you might want to build with a static site generator, maybe, depending on your use case. They're good for promotion. This is a portal type that we saw with one big multinational customer. And they basically had, this is the internal agility type of portal. You have a multi-siloed big corporation. They're all building portals all over the place. Building portals all over the place. They have got tons of APIs, and nobody knows what is there. And then they're just replicating work. And they're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so Catalog is to bring all of that together to enforce maybe even to enforce design principles in the APIs, to have governance set in place to make sure that the APIs look the same and that they adhere to certain principles, and to make sure that there's proper documentation for all of the APIs, and then bring it all under one place, and then expose it that way to their internal customers most of the time. Then you have partners and customer APIs. Often these have like restricted access, we've seen, because partner A might have access to this API that partner P doesn't have access to, and you don't want to make them upset because they just can't afford it, or you don't want to expose it to everybody. And then you get like granular access permission to your documentation also. And then the fourth one is this utility type of API, where you're selling your API kind of in a metered way. So it's not like you become a partner and you pay a certain amount, but you're measuring how much you're using it, like typical SaaS or cloud model, pay as you go. So these four kind of intermingle into different portals that we've seen. Another thing, and this is kind of like where most people start. Most people, like most API programs we've seen, they get kind of stuck on this step. And they're like, so should we use Swagger or RAML or API Blueprint? And then most of the time, depending on the API management company they work with, they'll pick one of these. The thing is that this is just like the tip of the iceberg, I think. It's important. This is like the specification that you'll use for designing your API and for documenting it. But I would argue that you need more documentation than that. Like for your tutorials, you don't really want to put that in your Swagger definition. What you'll then see is that when you start working with technical writers, they'll have preferences for Markdown. Some of them will like Dita, which is an XML language. For a lot of people, that's scary. So they might, like we've seen companies that have Dita and Markdown, like kind of mixed, that want to host it on GitHub, have pull requests for their documentation, and there's a whole zoo of different solutions and authoring tool chains out there. Some organizations just use a help authoring tool like RoboDocs, RoboDoc? Yeah, well, one of those. So it's probably something to think about. And then what portal technology do you use? As I said, Apigee is using Drupal for their advanced portal. They're now working on a new version of their portal, of their product that has of Edge, that has like an inbuilt minimalistic portal that just is that you don't really have to customize. Like with the Drupal portal, you need to put on some theming to make it look appealing and and to get something customized. I think that for advanced use, if you're going to be doing like an outward-facing project, or you want to do any of these 4 types that I talked about earlier, then probably you might want to evaluate if you want to use the Drupal portal. But there's other solutions. There's like hosted SaaS solutions, static site generators. What we've seen is a lot of developers, API developers, they get really excited when you start talking about making websites, and they want to build their own developer portal and integrate it in their continuous integration infrastructure. And that's all good and fun, but it kind of distracts from the main thing. and then often you get a subpar portal that is just draining energy. It's nice because it's static, so it can't be hacked. You don't have to maintain it as much. Well, you still have to maintain it, but less. I think I'm a Drupal guy. I think CMSs can definitely be a pro depending on use case, especially if you want to also include marketing content and sales content. Because I talked about this a little bit. This is a discussion on Write the Docs Slack. Tom Johnson, he's kind of like a really famous in the technical writer community, and he was talking about, I want a tool that is not going to force me to spend 10% of my time on tooling. I just want to write documentation. And still it needs to be inside, so I can't use a SaaS solution. What should I use? And so that's why I think that Drupal and Apigee is a really interesting combination and interesting solution. So if this sounds interesting, you want to know more, we're doing research. As I said earlier, we're now writing a blog post series about portal components, where we are evaluating, I think it's 7 portals, some of the most famous portals like Stripe and Twilio and the fancy ones, to see what are the different components that are being used by different organizations. And we're compiling a series about that, kind of analyzing that. It's going to evolve as we learn more. I'm talking about writing a book about this with 2 people in the community, just because there's just not enough knowledge about it available yet. There's also this thing about the maturity model. So we've got a bunch of blog posts, not just about components, but also about the strategies, like what I talked about today. Or presentations. I'm recording this. I hope this one is going to be good, and then I'll put it online. Different incarnations of this talk are also recorded and have found their way online. And we're sharing that. I run the Write the Docs meetup in London. If you want to get involved in either of these communities, you can just also ping me. I can point you to ways to get signed up for the Slack. Or if you have a developer evangelist or technical writer, I can introduce them to different communities. This is going to be in Paris. I don't know. Well, it's still close enough. 13th. Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Small thing. It's oops. I headed up. I headed up in Paris also for November, so nobody said anything. Probably too warm. There's several. It's kind of like high conference season. There's DevRelCon. That's also going to be in December. There's several different events that might be useful and interesting to attend. And then we are also working on a base package in Drupal 8, which is a new Drupal version, to build like a solid layer for technical writing, where you can plug in different authoring tool chains. If you want to learn about all of that, then sign up for our newsletter. And that's my pitch. So I'll bring it up in a moment. Just the conclusions. Developer portals are trust signals. I think that's an important one to carry away. I think probably one of the most important ones from this talk. APIs are products. You already knew this. Mature teams will also think about all their stakeholders, not just their developers. The developer journey is more than about troubleshooting. There's like all these different steps. There's these 4 types that I talked about for the architecture. The site owner's job to inspire, to educate, and authorize. And then last but not least, so I think the first one, trust signal, and the last one, be careful. Developer portals can be a trap. I didn't do it. For London, I'll have a slide. You know, it's a trap. You know the meme? It's a trap from Star Wars. Yeah. So I'll have that as a slide. Static site generators can be a trap. If you don't want to spend a lot of time building websites, it might be better to use a product for this. And make sure to sign up. So that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yeah?
I'm wondering, you mentioned this importance of this variable.
The viral loop, yeah.
For consumer developers or open API, that's very nice. But do you have any suggestions on B2B business? How to do this kind of business?
It depends, right? I think that well, I'm an open source geek, so I like open things. So while a lot of the work that we're doing is to like close off APIs, I think it might still be useful to have like a Trojan horse or like a bait API, you could call it. We talked about this with one customer, like a telecom customer, where you might want to have an API that your target audience might be interested in that gives some value already. Like for example, for telecom, that could be a device API to check what device somebody's using. So that's you get people to start trying your APIs and then find your portal and find what you're doing. And then even if they didn't know your product, they can see like, oh, these guys are serious and they know what they're doing. It seems like they have a lot of APIs. So it might be worth to talk with them about other things that are in their industry. Of course, if you say like, we don't do any of that, like all our APIs are private, then it's different. And then probably you need to do like internal hackathons or something like that. But I think that it makes a lot of sense to have at least one or two public APIs that people can try out and get hooked by, because they can help sell. One of the things that I tell a lot to people at documentation conferences is that your documentation is one of your most powerful sales tools today. People, if you put your documentation behind a wall, you're losing out because a lot of SEO words are in your documentation. When developers start looking for products that will fulfill their needs, they'll find your documentation and get interested, and maybe it can be a good lead source. So I think for B2B even, it's important to have some open documentation at least, or at least describe what you're doing. Maybe you don't say everything, but I like open, and I think a lot of developers have the same feeling. And developers are making a lot of buying decisions today, or are at least really important influencers. Okay. Yeah.
You show any example of
Yes. So we have. I think I have one. Yeah, here. This is one that we're working on right now. And wait, that's the program from Barrett. No. Have to go here. And this one was one. Now, most of these, we have basically been implementing what the customer asked us to do. So we haven't been doing too much strategy yet. Like the strategy research is fresh. I'm sharing, like straight from the research. so we're still working on like a set of services that can help with the actual advice of how to do the portal. Most of the work we've done is things like this, where we just make it pretty, or do access permissions, or do integration with login systems or stuff like that. So we have a lot of things in the pipeline. There's a lot of them that are not public yet, and a lot of them are, well, some of them are also behind a firewall, but we'll have more of them coming out. So if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll see more of that passing by also.